לארח היום את דוקטור אנדריאס מאיר, שהוא פרה-היסטוריון באוניברסיטת ארלנגן בגרמניה. הוא למד גם ארכיאולוגיה וגם בוטניקה, תארים ראשונים. את הפוסט-דוק שלו עשה בקולון על פליו-דמוגרפיה. ב-2015 הוא פרסם ספר Central European Magdalenian, Regional Diversity and Regional Viability. הוא הבסיס למחקר גם שהוא יציג היום. הוא מתמקד בתקופה המגדלנית במרכז אירופה, שהיא מתוארכת ל-20,000 עד 14,000 שנים לפני זמננו. אז Andreas, please, preference or abundance, would like the tradition of hunting fauna and animal representation during the Magdalenian in Central Europe.
תודה רבה בשביל ההזמנה. I hope I just said thanks for the invitation. Yes. Thanks also for the opportunity to present some of my research, which I not often have the chance to present. I was dealing from a PhD thesis with the Central European Magdalenian, but mainly concerned with the lithics, and the environment is also an aspect, but it's not. I rarely have the chance to talk about it, so I'm glad that I have the opportunity to talk about it now. I was told that I should also give a short introduction to the Magdalenian in general, what it is, because not everybody is supposed to be familiar with this. So this is going to be the outline of the talk. Many points, most of them I addressed rather briefly, don't be afraid. So after the introduction to the Magdalenian, I will talk about briefly some ideas about the selection processes which led to the composition of the faunal remains and also to the represented fauna. Then, well, since it's about preference, yes or no, I probably will say what I mean when I say that's preference or not. Then I will talk about the environmental condition throughout the Magdalenian in Central Europe. Afterwards, present the picture given by the hunted fauna, then compare this with the distribution of animal representation so that you can compare this, and afterwards, to have an external example, I will also give a case study from Franco-Cantabria, which I did not conduct myself, but colleagues some years ago. And afterwards, I will draw a conclusion about the question whether hunting preferences or preferences in representation are responsible for the composition or rather the natural abundance. The Magdalenian, it all started where many things started in southwestern France. Here you can see the rock shelter of La Madeleine, which has a trogloditic village in the central part, and in the lower part, this is the rock shelter which has been first excavated by Igor Aron-Laté and colleagues in the 1860s. And since Laté was a paleontologist by training, he first subdivided the Paleolithic record into stages according to the annals which are most represented during this part. So starting with the age of the cave deer, then cave of the mammoth, and the cave of the reindeer, which is more or less synonymous with the Magdalenian. And later for the Holocene, it's the age of the owl rocks. During his excavations, he very early discovered important pieces of artisan craftwork and animal representation, just to give you some impressions. But for the establishment of what's now called the Magdalenian, later works were more important. For example, those conducted by Henri Boyle, who in 1912 gave first overview and a subdivision of the Upper Paleolithic, including the Magdalenian, and he mainly used bone and antler projectile points to subdivide the Magdalenian chronologically. Later, Denis Perroni also excavated at the site and used part of it to include the lithics, the lithic implements, into the sequence constructed by Henri Boyle. And just to give you a short overview, that is more or less the result of their work. They had several consecutive chronological phases, which nowadays are assigned as lower, middle, and upper Magdalenian. And for the lower Magdalenian, you see that those single battle points are characteristic. Pieces like this, which are called navette, are also characteristic. And half-round rods, the so-called baguette de Nuremberg, are the important organic tools which can be found in the Middle Magdalenian, and they co-occur with these kind of lithics. You have triangular shaped bladelets, and you have real triangles which appear during the Middle Magdalenian. And later, you have these bark points which co-occur with a lot of back platelets. And what I only want to emphasize here is, so far, this part of the introduction was to show you that the Magdalenian has not been discovered as a single self-confined unit, but it was a long process which led to the creation of this analytical unit, which is not self-contained, and I will, in the next slides, show you that it really has a lot of internal variability and is not a homogeneous unit. Another point which I would like to emphasize is this break around 16,000 graded BP in the way that bark points have been produced. In the Middle Magdalenian, you had points made from antler and these triangles, these triangular barbs glued on it, on the sides. After 16,000, you don't find that anymore, and you have these barb points which are made from one piece of antler, with the barbs carved out of the piece itself. If you have a look at the textbooks, you will find different information about how long these triangles have been in use. I had a look at all the accessible chronological information, and if you throw out all the ambiguous sides, it really gives a very clear signal to my opinion that at 16,000 calibrated BP, more or less, there is a turnover which is shift from this composite bark point to these bark points just made from one piece. With regard to hunting, there's no shift associated with this. So before and afterwards, the hunting fauna is more or less identical. So it was rather a shift in hunting, well, in the way hunting implements were produced, and not so much in what was hunted. But what was hunted, I will talk about that later. The Magdalenian, we were talking about hunter-gatherer societies, very mobile societies. Just one famous example from the Rhineland, the site of Gönnersdorf, which is located at a bottleneck situation where the Rhine River just breaks through a very narrow, rocky area and then opens to the lower German plain. And you can see that the raw materials come from areas 100 kilometers to the north, the west, and the south. So there's a rather large catchment for a base camp, but this is something, these kind of catchments we can observe rather regularly for this time. So very mobile people who are moving a lot around in the landscape. And talking about landscape, this is also important to keep in mind. The Magdalenian spans a period from about 20,000 to 14,000 calibrated BP. And when talking about climate, it already started in the end of the what is called last glacial maximum, which is the maximum extent of glaciers around 20,000 calibrated BP roughly. Here you see a map of Europe during this period, and you can see the large extent of the Fenno-Scandian glacial ice shield. Great Britain was attached to the mainland, the northern sea lay dry, the sea level was about 120 meters lower than today. And in Central Europe, between the Alpine glaciers and the Fenno-Scandian glaciers, population had ceased more or less immediately. There are some very ephemeral points where maybe people were present, but otherwise populations had withdrawn to the Franco-Cantabrian region in the southwest and somewhere to the southeast. During the warming period, the glaciers melted. You had a northward movement of many of the vegetation, which followed the warming. Of course, the animal followed and all of the people followed. And the Magdalenian is essentially this. It's the period when Central Europe became recolonized after it has been abandoned during the last glacial maximum. There is, again in the textbooks, one theory how this took place, the recolonization of Central Europe. This is connected to the idea that it's a very homogeneous unit, and the idea is that it's spread from the Franco-Cantabrian region, around 20,000, in a unidirectional expansion, eventually spreading over Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, to eastern Poland, in, well, more or less one unidirectional movement. if this was the case, I would expect several assumptions that should be met, and I'm going to formulate two of those just for a brief introduction and see how it corresponds to the archaeological record. One assumption is that expanding hunter-gatherer groups should maintain close contact with their group of origin, because if you expand into unknown territories, the danger of ecological failure is very high. For subsistence, and also if you go to unsettled areas for marriage partners, you should maintain close relations to your group of origin. If this is the case, I would expect that this contact should show up in the archaeological record as an intensive exchange of concepts and goods, and thus rather as a gradual change, if at all. There should be no rupture, there should be no hard boundaries if we assume a unidirectional expansion from west to east. Let's check. If you just have a look at the raw material procurement patterns, this is what arises, giving the assumption of in-force embedded procurement, that is, that hunter-gatherers gathered their raw materials embedded in their daily and seasonal movements and did not exchange it very much, but gathered it for their daily use. Then the pattern we see should reflect regional groups who exploit together coherent areas, territories of some kind. And what you can see, it's these raw material patterns, they give a signal of 5 rather distinct regional groups, one located here in the French and Swiss Jura, one in the Upper Danube, one in the Rhine and Meuse area, one in eastern Germany and Bohemia, and the other one in Moravia and Poland. This does not speak against a unidirectional expansion. It gives a first impression about the internal structure of the Magdalenian, and please keep these groups in mind for the following explanations. Because next slide will show the distribution pattern of mollusk shells, and they work under completely different conditions than the raw materials. These are items which are exchanged over very, very large distances, 800 kilometers from the Atlantic coast to the central Rhineland, also from the Mediterranean to the Rhineland, 600 kilometers. So the acquisition patterns behind these items are not on a daily or monthly basis. Here we see probably exchange patterns indicating social relations. And what becomes apparent is that the first 3 groups in the west, in France and Switzerland, on the Danube and in the Rhine-Meuse area, they are participating in this very densely meshed pattern of acquisition, including the Paris Basin, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic coast. So they are part of this network, whereas the sites in the eastern part, they are not part of this network. They have different acquisition pattern coming from the Carpathian Foredeep or the Vienna Basin, but there's no other exchange at this level, which indicates a rather strong boundary and a break. It's not fading out, there's a break, which contradicts the assumption. This is a scatter plot of a linear discriminant analysis, and without going into details what it is, I'm just going to explain what it means. If you want, we can discuss the details later. It gives an impression of the distribution of the variety in the typological composition of each site analyzed. And what you can see is that the typological variation in the western part of the first 3 groups is best explained by this straight line, whereas for the groups in the eastern part, it's best explained by a straight line which runs perpendicular to the first. This, in statistics, points to a rupture. This is something completely different. So, although the sites we call all these sites Magdalenian, they are rather similar within themselves, but you can still have you can see differences according to region when it comes to the typological composition. At the exact same border, which is indicated by the mollusk shells. So again, here we see a clear rupture. The second assumption would be that in case of a unidirectional expansion, the sites in direction of expansion get gradually younger. That's very straightforward. That works for some times, but then not. After a certain point, the oldest Magdalenian sites get older again, which is not in accordance with the assumption. So eventually, I say we should assume for the resettlement of Central Europe to the Magdalenian bidirectional recolonization. One branch coming from the Franco-Cantabria region, which is also indicated by the shells and everything, and there's another branch coming from the eastern part with different population, with a lot of close interaction, because it's very similar in terms of technology and typology, but with a different place of origin. This is also to illustrate that the social landscape during the Magdalenian is not a homogeneous unit, and this pattern, this border, can also be observed in what follows an observation of the environmental situation. But just before, hunting technology during the Magdalenian, the spear thrower was the most important hunting weapon. Bow and arrow entered the area later, around during the late Paleolithic. During the Magdalenian, the spear thrower was the most important weapon, which is a long stick thrown by this atlaten, and essentially the projectile is a long ossuous or antler point where back plates are glued to the side. We have found one of these specimens in Parsava, where you can see that. So this is an in-situ find where the lithic implements are still attached to the antler point. That was the main hunting weapon. The main hunting game varied from region to region and throughout the millennia of the Magdalenian, but on a general level, you can say that reindeer and horse were by far the most important hunted game during the Magdalenian, in general. When it comes to the number, well, if you measure importance in quantities, you take the numbers, and the most numerous depicted animals, at least in Central Europe, were also reindeer and horse, which corresponds at a very broad level already. So, there are several ideas and theories about what drives these compositions. In hunting, it's optimal foraging, which really is the idea that you seek for the best solution for the energy you invest to the energy you can take out of the system. So you would target those animals which are easily accessible but yield at the same time a high caloric and energy return. Another idea is that these are cultural preferences, unrelated to energy harvesting, but some people in certain areas prefer to hunt bobbits, others prefer to hunt mammoth, other reindeer. So it's a cultural preference which is uncoupled from the abundance of animals. Then there's the idea of seasonality, that in the region people were hunting horse only in summer, for example, and reindeer only in winter, or the other way around, so that there's a seasonal signal which is responsible. And there's another theory which says, okay, maybe it's just I use the term encounter strategy, which is it just reflects the natural abundance of animals in the landscape. The animals which have been most abundant were just hunted the most, with any of these other very elaborate reflections necessary to explain the observed pattern. A little bit similar, it's for theories about the representations. Here are several, for example, the idea art for art's sake. People just did art for doing art itself. Then there's the idea of that it's related to hunting magic, that you paint the animals you want to hunt or you have hunted, or it's related to shamanism, that you try to access your totemic animal. Fertility magic was another explanation. The representation of male-female dichotomy, an idea put forward by Andreas Maier Preference, for example. Then some people say it's maybe an ecological, this whole package is kind of an ecological adaptation, meaning that it's part of the ecological niche of these people to be able to do all this, to have better access to animals, briefly. And again, there's the option that it just reflects the natural abundance in the environment. Interestingly, these later explanations that it's just abundance which we see, they have been met with a lot of skepticism, and many people seem to be very reluctant, particularly when it comes to the Cartesian Kraftwerk to explain the number and the ratios by simple reflection of the environment, because apparently often people think that things like cultural expression and artistic expression should be related to something more spiritual, or what you ever might call it, and not just these very profound observations of everyday landscapes. So, eventually became too fast. The question is, what drives the composition of the hunted fauna and animal representation during the Magdalenian and Central Europe? Is it preference? That means, is it a kind of conscious choice, or is it abundance and it's just they get what they see? What's a preference? When I say preference, I mean it's a conscious selection of a particular object or feature over other objects or features which are equally accessible and of a similar kind. The unselective use of objects just according to the availability, I would say this is not a preference. So I'm not in favor of this sentence, which I just want to quote. The Mesolithic in Europe marked a new way of life. Due to a much warmer climate, Europe became densely forested, megafauna perished, and a new mode of subsistence took hold. Hunting preference shifted from reindeer and mammoth to red deer and pigs. In my opinion, this is not a shift of hunting preferences, this is a shift of just natural abundance. There are no mammoth anymore and you can't hunt them. So that's, you can't prefer when it's not around. So this is not the sense of preference as I understand it. If I use preference, I'm talking about conscious selective choice. How can we infer preference from the record? If the faunal composition of a site shows, or sites in the region show repeatedly that a specific species or size class of species are repeatedly selected over equally able and equally abundant other animals in the region, then I say, okay, yes, there we have a preference. Preference might exist but cannot be proven if this preference lies with the most abundant species. Then it can be the case, but I don't see a way of saying, okay, there we have a preference, because it's just within the normal distribution of the background noise. Same applies for representations. If repeatedly we have an overrepresentation of a particular species or a particular size class relative to the natural occurrence, then I say it's a preference. If this lies again with the most abundant species and it's just coincident with the background noise, there might be a preference, but we can't prove it. This is just so background information for what follows now. The first thing I would like to do is just to construct an horizon of expectation for the natural environment, for the abundance of animals, by having a look at the environmental situation during the Magdalenian, and then I would like to compare these with the archaeological record, and not side by side, but on a larger spatial scale, because I think that a side-by-side comparison is not does not make sense at this point. But we should, since these people are mobile and move around a lot, we should step back and see the bigger picture. This is contrary to other opinions, for example, by Barn and colleagues, who are of the opinion that it only makes sense to compare individual cave figures with the bones from the same site. So I disagree here, and I proceed differently. Just to give you an idea about the climatic development for the Magdalenian, as I said, it starts already during the LGM, around 20,000 calibrated BP. And here you have the oxygen isotopes curve of the Greenland ice cores, of the Engelberg core. And what you can see that after a while you have a first temperature optimum, where temperatures rise. It used to be Las Stadium, but since it's not really stadial, it's not called Las Stadium any longer, so I just termed it late glacial optimum. Then you have a backdraw of temperatures. It gets cold again. This is the so-called Oldest Dryas or Dryas 1. And then temperatures rise dramatically, and this part is called burning. At the same time, what you can see is that the amount of solar energy which is available is rising constantly during this period. And so even during the Oldest Dryas, when you had a setback in temperatures, the available solar energy was higher than in the periods before. Solar energy is important for net primary production of plants, which is of course important for the animal which can browse and graze on them, and so for the whole food chain. And besides solar energy, the availability of moisture is a second important factor which drives the vegetation in the landscape. Here you see a plot for the main precipitation patterns over Europe during the last glacial maximum. The polar front has shifted southwards, and this caused the whole system of the precipitation-bearing cyclones to move southwards as well. Usually, nowadays, they are about here, and they bring a lot of rain and moisture to Western and Central Europe. During the LGM, the whole system has shifted southwards, and it coincided with the lake level high stands in the Near East, for example, because one branch was heading over the Mediterranean, bringing a lot of moisture to this area. But Central Europe and Western Europe was kind of cut off from moisture supply and became increasingly dry, much drier than you would expect it just by simple cooling. And this area, on the other hand, could profit because apparently there was one branch heading toward the Fennoscandian ice shield, because the maximum increase in ice volume in the Alpine glaciers was in the eastern part. Here you have the maximum dome, or for the Fennoscandian ice shield was located about here over what is today the Baltic Sea. So these areas received sufficient moisture supply to grow ice in substantial ways. So there should have been a second branch heading over here and supplying these areas with moisture. Today it's the other way around. You would have rather Atlantic climate over here, moisture, and continental climate drier there. So for the colder period, these patterns seem to change a little. Well, on the large scale, what you always read is the Eurasian northern area was part of the mammoth steppe, which again is thought as a rather homogeneous environment, where these cold-adapted animals were more or less evenly distributed in the landscape. This, of course, is not the case. So also Europe was considered a more or less homogeneous mammoth steppe. Now, if we have a look at the pollen spectra, which we can have from the area, the late Pleniglacial optimum, so the period around 18,000, calibrated BP, you can see that it's not homogeneous. The green parts are pinus pollen, pinus trees in this case. Yellow is birch. The red stuff is grasses, so I'd say it is cereals, wild cereals. And the bluish part are herbs, perennial plants. And what you can see here that the perennial plants are more abundant in the southwestern part, whereas the steppic elements increase in the northwestern part. And still for this period, pinus pollen is rather high. Of course, pollen is wind distributed, and in environments which do not produce a lot of pollen themselves, as steppic periods, there may be a big proportion of wind-transported pollen. But it's important to keep in mind the main wind direction also during this period was from west to east. And the next stand of pine pollen were probably over here in the Carpathian Mountains. This can't be explained by wind vegetation alone. Probably we had here and there small stands of pine still preserved in this area. This changes during the Oldest Dryas, when it gets drier again in this area probably. The picture we just saw just becomes more pronounced. It does not change very much. You see that trees disappear more or less from the northwestern part, and you have a steppic environment. Down here in the southwestern part, you have a tundra environment, where herbs prevail over grasses and others. And in the eastern part, you have a lot of birch and pine pollens available, which means that there were some, and not that it's a forested environment, but that you had smaller stands of scattered trees distributed all over the landscape and the sheltered places. And if you recall what I've shown you before, this is more or less the border between the eastern and the western part of also the networks I showed you, and what's called the Magdalenian. So there's a very strong correspondence to this forested, to this parts which has here and there some trees, and this unforested part. What does this mean for? Okay. we proceed to the warming phase, and the picture does not change very much actually. The only thing that changes is that shrubs become more numerous, especially in the south. Juniper is going to enter, and the environment is becoming more bushy, which is not good for reindeer, for example. They need open landscapes. But the northwest stays rather open, steppe prevailed, and the east doesn't change much. It's more or less the same than before. So you have these, the mammoth steppe is not homogeneous, but you have parts which are more tundra-like, parts which are more steppe-like, and parts where you have here and there some trees. And this, of course, also is reflected in the faunal distribution. Before I just going to show you now the faunal assemblages from the central Magdalenian sites, so this is a distribution level of the sites that I analyzed, and maybe it's not very well visible, but on the right-hand side, the sites are more or less twice as numerous than in the left-hand side. So if I'm going to show distribution maps now, and the sites where animals are identified are more numerous in the western part, this is also wise because there's simply more sites which have been analyzed. Okay, if we have a look at ibex, then you can see that well, it's most abundant in the areas which are slightly hilly and mountainous. Here would be the Alps, and these are the hilly parts, hilly and slightly mountainous parts just in front of the Alps. And everywhere where there are some slightly hilly environments where you would expect ibex, you can find them. And the most abundant part is here in the southwest. This kind of meets the expectation. Bovids are a kind of problem because in the archaeological record they're really hard to distinguish. So you can't really, well, it's hard to say whether this is Bosphorus or Bosporus, and so many people just include and say they are bovids. So this is not a very precise picture. Anyways, you can see that they are distributed more or less everywhere where you can graze and browse. No particular signal. Mammoth, there's already a shift to the northern part, which well, are more open and not that hilly. So mammoth, in their background distribution, are distributed more to the north. Woolly rhinoceros, again, shifts a little bit more to the eastern part. Saiga occurs only in the northern part of the investigated area, not in the southern part. And muskox, they have a very peculiar, only one spot distribution in the southern part. The problem here is that the numbers of sites containing these animals, they were too low to really have good access. So now I'm going to show you a picture with reindeer and horse, which has a more substantial database. That's this one, where you have ratios of horse and reindeer displayed. The red dots are sites which are exclusively reindeer. The light red ones, they're reindeer dominated. These, well, morph-like color represents assemblages which are more or less equally between horses and reindeers. The light blue is horse dominated, and the dark blue is horse dominated, and dark blue is horse exclusively. And what you can see is that you have a gradual shift from southwest to northeast, which corresponds to the vegetation pattern. Apparently, in the tundra landscape, reindeer is more abundant and a better competitor. In the more steppe-like environment, it's horse. That's what you can just see in this picture. And so here I say I don't see any kind of hunting preference. Or it's when there is a lot of horse, people hunt a lot of horse. When there's a lot of reindeer, people hunt a lot of reindeer. But no hunting preference for the most abundant species for the Central European Magdalenian. There has been a study some time ago by Woodard Rutland, who had access only to a small sample. 6 sites from the Central European Magdalenian and 2 sites located in France were analyzed, and she found that there is an explicit seasonal priority, reindeer for the fall and the spring hunting, and horse in winter and summer. That would indicate a seasonal preference. If we now take a look at the sites that she analyzed, you can see that the horse-dominated assemblages come from areas where horse generally dominates the assemblage, whereas reindeer come from the areas where reindeer generally dominates the assemblage, which kind of leads me to the conclusion that I would not subscribe that season is the main driving factor for the composition, but again, it's just the abundance of animals. It's not seasonal choice, it's the abundance of animals in the group. Yes, so no hunting preference identifiable. That does not exclude optimal foraging, since horse and reindeer, when they are more abundant, it's kind of optimal foraging to hunt them preferentially. But it's not a selective choice. It corresponds to the abundance, and also seasonality is not the explanation for the pattern we can observe. The blue dots now just show the representation of animals for the same area. So ibex is mostly represented where it's found the most. Bovids are, well, they're a little bit everywhere, like the distribution of the faunal remains. Mammoth is distributed majority over there, in the northern part. And well, these are small numbers, but given that there are only 5 rhinoceros representation and 4 of them are located here in the northeastern part, this kind of, again, gives impetus to the impression that it's the abundance that drives it. The painting Saiga, same thing, it's depicted where it occurs, and muskox, again, it's depicted where it occurs, not elsewhere. If we have a look at reindeer and horse, that's the same representation for reindeer and horse, same color code. So red are the reindeer, the sites where representations have exclusively been on reindeer, dark blue is sites which exclusively representation of horse, and the shading in between is the transition. And if you compare these two maps, they are more or less identical, strongly indicating that there was no preference or selective choice in terms of the representation, but people just represented the stuff they have seen the most, and they were hunting the stuff they've seen the most. So natural abundance is the main driving factor for the composition of hunting game and for representation, according to my opinion, in the Central European Magdalenian. Exactly. This is contrary again to the notion that what Barn and his colleagues found in southwestern France, and they say in short, the relationship between depicted and eaten species ranges from non-existent to quite good, and it's clear that the motivation behind the art were different from the environmental factors and economic choices which produced the faunal remains. Well, so they were working in southwestern France. For the Central European Magdalenian, I'm pretty sure that this is not the case. Abundance is the single most important factor. But if you have a look at the Franco-Cantabrian region, he also cites another study which he thinks was a complete waste of effort, since it only makes, it was another study a little bit similar to what I did, and they were comparing on a larger scale the composition of bones and the represented animals in southwestern France. And the authors of this study, Rice and Patterson, they found the analysis from both France and Spain have confirmed that the overall pattern of faunal cave art is clearly related to the size of the 5 major species, the size class signal, and the relative prevalence of the 5 species in the archaeofauna of local environments, which is more or less abundance. These are the areas which they analyzed. So you have northern Spain and southwestern France, and in the graphs I'm going to show, they are organized by region from west to east. So the first are these 4 areas, then you have the hills from the Pyrenees on the French side, and then you have these sites in southwestern France, in the Dordogne and Garonne region. These are the species they have analyzed. This is very colorful now, and I'm going to have a look at that in detail. What you can see is that red deer, for example, is abundant in the southernmost areas, so where you would, even deciduous trees could grow during this period. And as soon as you get north of the Pyrenees, where you have these open landscapes, steppe landscape, red deer disappears. To the contrary, the reindeer has the complete opposite signal. It's very low in the northern Spanish areas, then rises in this region, peaks in the open landscapes, and horse and bovines, they are more or less equally distributed everywhere. Mammoth more or less only occurs north of the Alps, and ibex is hunted most in the hilly regions and not so much in the not hilly regions. So the composition of hunting fauna, again, I say this is what you would expect if you just have a look at natural abundance. What about the representations now? Picture changes, and if you just have a look like this at the graph, you have the impression that it's something completely different and really changes and is not as it was expected. The question is, if you say it corresponds to abundance, do you mean a one-to-one correspondence, meaning 86 reindeers hunted, 86 reindeers depicted, or is it the ratio which has to correspond? So what I did now, for those species which have an offset, I simply multiply the depicted animals with the same number to make them better comparable to the record, which is then not a one-to-one correspondence but a correspondence of ratio. And this I'm going to show you. For red deer and horse, it wasn't necessary. In red, these are the hunted, the signal of the hunted fauna, and black, these are the depicted animals. And what you can see, red deer is one-to-one correspondence without any manipulation. Horse as well, one-to-one correspondence without any manipulation. So at least for these species, any kind of preference can be excluded. Again, abundance drives the depiction. It's a reindeer if you multiply the depicted animals with 3, this is what you get. Again, this is the hunting curve and this is the depicted curve. It matches, except for one exception, very well. Ibex multiplied by 2 has one excursion to the contrary, but otherwise fits very well. Bobbits have this one excursion, but otherwise fits very well. Mammoth fits very well. So if you don't expect a one-to-one correspondence, but the correspondence of ratio, here again, that's the pattern you get. If you compare it overall, you can see that there is a shift. The hunted animals represented in red, they peak in these smaller size classes. So here the animals, they are sorted according to size classes from ibex to mammoth. And you can see that the majority of the hunted animals are reindeer and red deer. This size class, and the depicted animals, there's a slight overhang of horses and bobbits. So there may be a slight over-representation of bobbits, maybe preferentially, and a slight under-representation of reindeer. Yes, so that's again what Rice and Patterson also said. And I say yes, but ibex gives a mixed signal. Mammoth has very low numbers, so if this is significant in terms of statistics, I don't know. Horse and red deer are represented evenly, so maybe it's bobbits and reindeers who are kind of who show kind of shift you can see in the archaeological record. Therefore, the conclusion: during the Magdalenian, the site's faunal composition highly depends on the geographic location, and it's the abundance of the species that drives hunting preferences. The same applies for Central Europe, also for the representation. It closely mirrors the fauna, and at least in the Franco-Cantabrian rock art, the possible exception are these reindeer and bobbits, but otherwise you can say it's the environment is more or less equals the hunted fauna, which is more or less equal to the represented fauna. Thank you for your attention.
Very interesting. Any questions? I will start. Do you think that the relationship between the abundance of animals and the local environment is so significant that you can reconstruct the environment by the species frequencies? If you didn't know, maybe like climate change over time in this area?
I think reconstruction would be overstressing the signal, because animals are very adaptive when it comes to shifting environments. So people think of roe deer that belongs exclusively to forested environments. Now we see that in landscapes which have been anthropogenically cleared from forests, that roe deer behave, they change their behavior. They live in larger groups, they show the flight patterns of migratory game, so they can adapt, and every now and then you find a red deer in cold, adapted environments where you can wonder whether it belongs there or not, but it seems that the that they are more flexible. They prefer, if they can have a certain environment, they probably will go there. But so you can get a reconstruction, but I think it is fluid and yeah, not so valid.
You should see that the change between horses and then reindeer in the same area. Would it assume that the climate change?
Yes, overall. But so if you want to have a broad image or a broad idea on a large scale, I think this works. And if you see shifts in the animal record, something has happened. Yeah.
Would you suppose that what we see in the representation is not biased by people? For example, the association of various animals in the representation of different sites. Do they have anything to do with the outside? With the same associations in the outside?
I'm not sure if I really got the question.
Can you recognize or identify associations of animal species, 1, 2, 3, or 4, within the representation? And how does this refer to what is going on outside in terms of how the abundance is shaped in nature?
Animals which are depicted together.
Yes.
So for the Central European Magdalenian, which I know a little bit, usually they are not depicted in groups. So usually you have one animal per item, or it's a repetition of the same animal, but it's very rarely that you have a group of animals, or that this occurs so regularly that you could infer anything about animals occurring together. For southwestern France again, if you have the portable art, the mobile artisan craftwork, this is the same pattern more or less. And if you have the rock art, well, then it's everything together.
But if you look at the representations at the level of the site, of the specific depiction,
well, yeah,
would there be any associations that relate to the outside?
This is one of my points. I say yes, it is, and it corresponds more or less one-to-one. People depicted what they saw. And for the Central European Magdalenian, also more or less in terms of not exact quantities, but at least in the ratios. When there were more horses around, they were depicting more horses, but also reindeer when there were some reindeer, and mammoth when there was a reindeer, and mammoth, and a saiga antelope when there was a saiga antelope. So that's what I'm saying. There is a one-to-one correspondence more or less with the geographic location of the site, the stuff which is represented, and the faunal background, which I assume for this region.
Well, you mean they mainly depicted what they ate, and they ate what they saw, something like that. But let's go back to that later. If I understood correctly, you said that there is an underrepresentation in the depictions of larger animals like bovids, overrepresentation in the depictions of larger animals like bovids, right? Doesn't that leave you some room to think that the animal remains that you find at the archaeological sites are biased by the fact that these taxa were brought to the site by humans, including the bones, while larger taxa could be processed in a different way, and you would find other representations of their bones at the sites. Am I clear?
Yes, of course. The toponymic processes are an important topic, of course. And here I was just for these Franco-Cantabrian stuff, I did not go into the details. I just took what was written in the literature, and I could not do a toponymic analysis. But a lot of them are rock shelters, and I assume that also the smaller animals, that they were brought in by predators sometimes, which also occupy these areas. So there certainly is a kind of toponymic bias within it. I only right now can't assess in which direction it will change. The stuff. What we can think about it? Yeah. What would be what bias you would expect?
Yeah, but if this is the case, it is not necessarily so that the taxa that you see at the sites are representative of the availability of taxa in the landscape. I'll give you another example from a different angle. If you check the isotopic record of what animal ate, in many cases it shows an overrepresentation of mega herbivores, while you don't see this exact scale at the sites. You see what I mean? You see overrepresentation of mammoths and rhino in the isotopic record
Of the people.
but you don't see these animal remains at the sites where they ate these animals, because most probably they didn't carry the bones to the sites. So
Yes, if the signal was completely compromised by taxonomic processes, I wouldn't expect to have such a close mesh. That's the first thing, and then isotope studies are, of course, a very important source of knowledge. But if you assume fish with a diet, which you often do not find in the faunal record because these sites have been excavated a long time ago, and if you do not do wet seeding, fish are gone. Fish pushes your isotope signal in direction of carnivores, and it makes you look like you have eaten a lot of mega herbivores, if it's not considered in the diet. So also these isotope signals, they have a lot of problems within itself, and I'm not sure if you can really use the isotope record of humans to calibrate the taphonomy of sites. I think this is it doesn't work yet.
but again, if I may, I would think of separating medium and large herbivores from mega herbivores in everything that has to do with the Schlepp effect, with what people brought to the sites, because this might bias your observations.
I agree. I agree.
Your faunal
Yeah.
composition.
Yes, I'm the stuff I know a little bit where I look inside the Central European Magdalenian. This is just something I'm referring to, which more or less matches the study is rather old. And if you have a look at how the faunal compositions were combined, they also included sites where it says few reindeers and a lot of reindeers, and they made classes according to these relative proportions and included it in the analysis, which I would not do if I would conduct the analysis. But
did you try to make any kind of distinction whether specific taxa were brought to the site complete or in different parts, in different elements?
No, because so my the aim of my study when I did it was to get an overview about the regional differences in the Magdalenian. I did not do any kind of taphonomic analysis myself, and I'm not even, I can't even distinguish a horse from a bobby if you have it in the laboratory. So
Only if you eat it. And isn't it the case that the seasonality might affect the availability of taxa year-round? I mean, you present the case like there's no room for seasonality to make any effect on the taxa availability at the sites. Is it really the case? I mean,
No. Seasonality certainly plays a role, but it does not explain the picture we see. So it's I think the composition of the sites which were selected are better explained by their geographic position than by seasonality. That seasonality is important for the composition of the hunt fauna. That's I think that's evident.
No sign for domestication of horses,
Domestication of horses.
or management at least.
Not as far as I can tell. So, Marcel Ott sometimes brings up the idea, and I met him some month ago in Liège, and we talked again about the option of horse domestication. From my point of view, I see no evidence whatsoever that that would support the domestication of horse for the Magdalenian in Central Europe.
Do they have dogs?
Yes. Well, the oldest dog from the region is slightly younger. It's like 14,000. It's the famous dog from Bonn over Kassel. but genetic analysis point to the fact that dog domestication has taken place already in the Magdalenian, and we kind of assume that dogs, even if not very frequent, might have been already around doing it. But here I'm only referring the stuff I was reading myself.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, you mentioned one area where there was an overlap between deer and between reindeer and horses. Are these caves only reindeer horse, only reindeer caves, and with only decorations of reindeer and only decorations of horse? Or do the same caves have both animals?
As I said, if you make a one-to-one comparison just by sight, then the signal gets blurry, or sometimes you have contradictory results. Every red dot has either exclusively reindeer bones or reindeer representations that might coincide. Sometimes, but generally it gives an overall pattern, and the same applies for horses. And many of those are also open air sites. These are not only cave sites. Actually, down here in the southwestern part, there are many cave sites, but over here, most of them are open air sites.
But what you were saying earlier is that the reindeer and horses overlap. So, but you're also saying that there are places which are exclusively reindeer and exclusively horse. So, why is there a difference? Why is there a difference? In theory, both of these animals are abundant in these areas, so they ought to both be turning up at all the sites. No?
Yes, and so there's a spatial gradient, and this matches. There's a spatial gradient from southwest to northeast, from reindeer-dominated to horse-dominated, which coincides with the vegetation, where there's a gradient from a tundra environment with a lot of herbs to a more steppe environment to the northeast. And this, in the reindeer, apparently are a better competitor in tundric areas. It's not that there has never been a horse. No, there are sites where they have where there are a lot of horses hunted. Which is kind of an exception in the whole area, but a horse hunting place. So there are horses every now and then. I don't know, but just if you look at the overall distribution, it's this spatial gradient from reindeer-dominated to horse-dominated.
What would that mean culturally?
Culturally,
The fact that people depict the animals as they see them in the landscape. No preference. What would you say about the meaning of the whole thing? If we accept that this is the situation.
I would say people take inspiration from what they see the most.
So you mean the depictions are kind of accepting what's going on in the landscape.
It's a reflection.
No other purpose.
No, I don't see any arguments to support other purposes. I would say it's a reflection of the environment. People reflect about the environment, and the environment is reflected in what they are doing. That's what the archaeological record, at least for the Central European Magdalenian, tells me.
But again, the question is why. It is very clear why people ate what was around. This makes sense. But why they make depictions of what they ate and was around is a different question.
Don't they have any preferences in terms of dangerous animal, not dangerous, big animal, small animal, fast animal, furry animal, whatever? I mean, the way you present it, it looks as if it's a one-by-one relationship. It has no biases whatsoever.
If you want, it seems like they were depicting their menu. In a way.
Well, it has nothing to do with hunting magic, and it's not that I depict what I want to eat or something. It's
No, I'm not talking about magic.
And these things can be completely unrelated. It's just people using the landscape in an opportunistic manner, hunting what's there, and they reflecting what they see. So, and I don't think that there's a surplus to it.
Is
something which is
everything they see depicted.
No.
There are animals that appear in the assemblages and are not depicted in the caves. What are these? Non-important animals? No tasty meat? No good fur? What? Why not? If they do it one by one, why don't they do it for everything?
Oh, yeah, good question. Why are beetles so few represented? Or other, at Gönnersdorf you have a frog and you have some animals which are usually not represented. But if you take, well, the medium and larger animals which are around, this is more or less what I showed. Other animals of these size class run that much abundant. That's what we have. Then that's the signal you get. That's
I want to, if I understood what you said, so climate made it affected the distribution of animals. So, yes, so because of climate, you had this specific, and this was, and according to what animals that were there, this is what they hunted. There were no hunt. So this can make sense, or it's natural. But when you come to representation, it's something else. It's not so natural. Representation, it's something else. It's not, all right, these are the animals that are available, this is the animals that I will hunt, this is the animal I will eat, but why will they be the same animals that I will represent? And is it in the picture, in the data that you have, because I was waiting to hear what, maybe there's something different. Maybe there is something in the data, also because you said it's culture, and they had, it's important, it's a very long culture, and it has two branches. Is there anything in this culture that you can identify, or you can tell something about it by the way they represent the representation of animals in or it's really one-on-one?
Well, I don't see any signals from the record that would indicate that there is more to it than abundance. People want to have nice things. They wanted to have a nice spear thrower. Then you can carve a horse, or you can carve a reindeer, or you can carve a mammoth. And it seems that people were carving mostly the stuff they were seeing the most. They wanted to have nice things, and they were just inspired, reflecting their natural environment. That's what the picture tells me.
It's not always this, you know. We represent, representation, we have blonde girls, and we don't have any.
Well, as far as I know, there are no tall blonde girls depicted in the Magdalenian record. We can't say anything about the hair colors. Women were depicted, but they rarely depict the hair.
So does mean the Magdalenians had no gender in terms of representation?
And no preferences.
Well, in the southwestern part, maybe they had slight preferences for boys. There seems to be, there may be a point, but that needs closer analysis. It's worthwhile looking at it. For the Central European Magdalenian, no, there's no gender.
How about the context where the depictions were made?
In this area,
Yes.
well, these are mobile pieces. There's no rock art in Central Europe. It's only portable pieces, stone slabs, figures, engravings, stuff like this. No rock art.
No
So
rock art.
we don't have any caves or rock shelters painted or with engravings. No.
Excuse me, it's an informative question. Is it a large amount of mobile pieces that have the animal representation?
What's a large amount?
What's the quantity? What's the quantity?
Yeah, okay. I should know that by heart, but I have to look it up, I'm afraid. But if I just
No, just a general idea.
Yes. How many slabs are there in Gönnersdorf alone? Hundreds of engraved chists in Gönnersdorf alone, which is the most rich site, of course. Others are in these southwestern German sites. There are a lot of things engraved in bones.
Well, dozens, hundreds, or
well, in total, well, if we exclude Börnersdorf, maybe completely, then I guess we are more or less around 100, 150. But right, well, I need to look that up. I don't know. I really don't know about it. But just that's guessing.
Items in one site.
No, in the area.
In the area.
We can talk. I'm not sure everyone is interested. Just one maybe comment or a thought. In many cases, for example, spirit wars were depicted with animal depictions. Wouldn't you think that this depiction of the hunting weapon with the depiction of the hunting animal has anything to do with the hunt itself, with the relations of the hunter with the hunted animal and so on? Or it is just purely reflection of what the hunter saw in the landscape?
Well, I don't think that you would use a reindeer decorated spear thrower only to use a reindeer, and if there's a horse in front of you, that you would say, oh, sorry, but I have my horse spear thrower with me.
Why not?
So, because you might get hungry.
And you might have a spear thrower for the horse.
Well, you might carry along both. Well,
Yes.
As for the mobile art for the Franco-Cantabria region, I have no clue, actually. There's no study, it's such a quantity. I know of no study who ever looked into it in more detail, but that would be certainly worthwhile. And maybe there are some interesting patterns to emerge.
You know, we just had a lecture, I think, about 2 weeks ago, from a scholar that works in Canada with the Innu. And you know, the Innu, they have specific leashes for dragging specific animals they hunt, and each leash is made of the animal which they drag, and they would never drag an animal with a leash which is not made from the same animal. So there are many possibilities.
There are many possibilities, and I'm not saying that I'm going to exclude these possibilities. I'm only saying that I can't see that in the record. I can't see it in the archaeological record.
Maybe just one remark that goes through my head. I mean, the empirical correlation in between the abundance of the prey and, let's say, the depictions is, of course, not to be understood as a one-to-one interpretation, but then the depictions and the meaning of the depictions is. Yeah? So,
on the contrary, Torsten,
yes.
It makes me think that there is a very strong correlation between the depictions, the hunting animals, and what was available. And these depictions are very strongly connected to the hunt and the hunting of the animals, in my opinion. But this is my reading of the data.
Yes, but I mean,
this is in my head.
No. I mean, I go into the same direction, but that does not mean that the meaning of the depiction is a simple one. I sometimes have the impression in the discussion.
No, it's not simple at all.
Yeah,
but
okay. Then it was a misunderstanding on my side.
In many cultures, in many archaeological records, the hunter used the image of the hunted animal in order to make the hunt more successful, in order to make himself the animal, and so on. They use small amulets of sharks in order to hunt sharks. They use a hunting weapon made of whale bones in order to do whaling, to hunt whales. Why this could be the case here?
It can be.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I mean,
that's the only point.
Yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I have in mind
concerning
as well.
the complexity of the explanation of what these depictions mean, that's a different story. I'm just trying to find out from Andreas about the information, because the whole thing could be, for example, accompanied by a certain kind of a song that is different for the different animals. And the whole story is changing. But you will not find it in the record, of course. Or a dance. They do.
Poem which
Do in the
recited.
you find a lot of small behaviors. Just before hunting, while hunting, after hunting, that relate to things that the record will not show.
This is from this picture, there are lots of things we can't exclude, which may also hide. There may be a preference for horses in the northwestern part also, but it's just it's invisible because it's just covered by the background noise. And when things correspond to background noise, you have to assume beforehand, just to be on to have a more conservative approach, that there is no real meaning to it. That it really is just background noise, and that's all there is.
This what you presented here is the base start for meaning.
Okay. Well,
Yes,
yes.
it's not.
I don't
Doesn't
say
mean
that's
it's
not
not
here. No. This I would be glad if people take this as a starting point to go further.
Of course, there must be.
Okay, thank you very much.